Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this month's Macro Salon. You'll notice one slight change from the advertised proceedings in that I am not Bill Emmett. My name is Michael Rivera-King and I'm Chief Executive of the Japan Society here in the UK. Bill is hoping to be joining us very shortly. The Irish telecommunication system has been cut off to his house. I don't know if he's annoyed in his Secret Service, but he's trying to get back online via his phone. I'm delighted today that we are joined as always by Jesper and Tobias Harris is also joining this month, which is a real privilege. So yeah, welcome to you both. How are you both keeping? And Jesper, I wonder if we could perhaps start with any updates or thoughts you have on the latest in the Japanese economy.
Yes, Michael, thank you very much. And I certainly hope that Bill is going to come through and join us. Just sort of a very quick overview on a couple of things that have, changed in the Japanese macro environment here. And, the good news is that actually when you look at the data, you actually see that actually very little has changed. And most importantly, you recall that the prime thesis for why one should be optimistic on Japan is this pickup in the corporate metabolism. And that, of course, is corporate action that actually looks towards the future. And most importantly here, we've got business investment expenditure, CapEx. And the latest data, is pretty uniform, just highlighting the Tankan survey, for example, which just came out a couple of days ago. You actually do find that double-digit growth of business investment expenditure for the third year in a row is what we are seeing here in Japan. And this is not foreign direct investment. This is investment here in the domestic economy. And if you go into the details, you see that it's not just big in terms of scale for the third year running, but that the depth and breadth actually continues to expand. What do I mean by that? It goes into both the industrial sector as well as the domestic service sector. And it also goes both into the large listed companies as well as the small and medium-sized companies. So it's very, very important to see that, a new generation of corporate leaders is actually investing in the future in terms of both, capacity expansion as far as the service sector is concerned, and also capital deepening, buying and equipping with better machinery to actually become productive. And so as a result of that, I think that the probability of productivity surprising on the upside in both the industrial sector as well as the service sector, that probability from a macroeconomic perspective is actually very, very good. The second thing that is very important on the positive side is that you do see a continued acceleration in wage and income growth for the young generation. Aggregate incomes, right, in nominal terms, are still, growing only at about 1.5%. And of course, with 2% inflation, you actually have aggregate real incomes still on a modest decline. However, the generational divide of, the people in their 20s and 30s now experiencing real income growth on the order of 3.5% to 4%, while the generation 60 and above, is actually seeing real incomes declining. That barbell, continues to be in place, but obviously for an investment strategy, you now do want to continue to focus on this new middle class that is being built, by the younger generation, seeing significant increases in both nominal incomes as well as in real incomes. And of course, also in terms of overall job security and quality of contracts. Very importantly, actually, over the last year, actually 120% of all new jobs created were full-time jobs. Negative for part-time employment, 20%, right? But, part-time employees being rehired on a full-time basis is a very real development that you have here. So on the positive side, capital investment expenditure, the corporate metabolism, very, very much alive and well, continuing to expand. And on top of that, this younger generation of Japanese stepping up to the plate, getting higher real incomes, greater job security, and also beginning to leverage, which is what you can see in the mortgage data, where the demand for the average home in the metropolitan areas continues to grow and expand. No, it's not the rich Chinese who are buying Japanese real estate. It is actually that rise in the new middle class that is buying average apartments. So that's sort of on the positive side of things.
Fantastic. That's a great overview. Thank you, Jesper. One question, and then perhaps I'll turn to sort of bring in Tobias as well. What do you think is prompting that wage increase for the younger generation? Is it sort of demographics, sort of purely fewer people looking for the same jobs, or what are the other mechanisms?
No, and thank you, Michael, for pointing this out. And I think it's very, very bare bone supply and demand in the labor market. The reality that Hitachi is having problems, hiring engineers on its old schemes. And as a result of that, Hitachi now introducing merit-based compensation and genuine career opportunities. Recruit did a wonderful study. They're actually doing this once every quarter now, and they actually found that now consistently listed companies are recruiting more people mid-career than they are recruiting at the graduate intake level. So labor mobility is actually increasing. And you actually find in the data that approximately half of the people hired mid-career for the large corporations are seeing a wage and income increase of around 15%. So it's quite interesting, that we always talked about one of the potential, impediments was the lack of mobility, the lack of liquidity in the Japanese employment market. But now that labor is tight, that the competition for labor, the war for talent is actually broadening out very, very aggressively. And everybody recognizing that this is not a one-off cyclical problem, but this is a structural issue that is only going to get worse as a result of that virtuous cycle of growing wages, better contracts, and rising liquidity is actually starting to come through.
That's fascinating. Thank you. It's a great overview. I would like to next introduce our sort of guest for this the salon. So Tobias Harris is founder and principal of Japan Foresight, a Japan-focused political risk advisory firm. He's an expert on Japanese politics, and in 2006-07 was on the staff of Keiichiro Asao, who was at that time in the upper house of the Japanese Diet and shadow foreign minister for the DPJ. He has recently been featured in The Guardian, and this past weekend was in the FT. So we are perfectly placed to kind of look at this transition to the new government and the impact that they may or may not have moving forwards. So, Tobias, if I could perhaps ask you to kind of speak a little to the changing of the guard and what you think that may mean.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Thanks. Always good to see Jesper as well. I think the way to really pick up from where Jesper was talking is how much change is happening bottom up. How much is that workers voting with their feet, the choices that new graduates are making and then that they leave a few years later, the fact that you now have this growing appetite for mid-career job changes. There is change. It is bubbling up, and in some ways it seems that the job of Japan's government is kind of to stay out of the way, not putting up impediments to this, recognizing how much appetite there is for change just in corporate Japan, both among workers and among managers and among investors, not being put in the way of that. And so I guess with that, I guess with that is the question is, is the Ishiba government going to be in the way of that, or is it going to promote it, or is it going to just sort of stand to the side? And I think the thing to keep in mind, I think, about uh, Mr. Ishiba is, I mean, and really whoever emerged from the LDP's leadership election, 9 candidates, the question was going to be the same, which is how is this new leader going to be able to govern, particularly the party, where you have a party that showed itself over the course of a month. There are actually a number of divisions. There's a lot of ambitious personalities. There are conflicting philosophical ideas about how to govern Japan. You have very different ideas about how to govern the economy. And so coming out of this leadership election, you were going to have this challenge of how to govern the party, how to address some of the fallout from the scandals we've seen, how to bring the public back, whether there's going to be the ability to really get a robust mandate in the general election that Ishiba has already said will happen at the end of the month. And that was going to be first and foremost, because if the prime minister cannot control the party, cannot use it as an instrument, we are going to be in a situation where you have weak prime ministers, you have changes of government, and maybe Japan's economy is fine. Maybe the macro forces, the redirection of investment from China and the reshoring of investment and looking, the expansion of capital expenditures that Jesper talked about, maybe that continues regardless. But I do think there are things that the Japanese government has to get right. That I think there are things that need to happen, to encourage startup formation. I'm a big fan of Rick Katz's latest book, and detailing the number of regulatory changes that could be made to push this process forward. You want government that is going to stick around. I mean, look, on the negative side, you have a dangerous regional environment. You want a government that is able to stick around and manage the challenges that Japan faces. And if we are in a situation where governments are changing, where prime ministers are falling, that is not going to be good for the investment climate. It's going to, I think, dampen some of the energy and the spirits that we've seen. And so that is the question. It is very much an active question. It's a live question. I think, over the weekend we saw Ishiba announcing a policy of withholding the party's endorsement from some of the more senior LDP politicians implicated in the corruption scandal we saw over the past year. And he is now facing something of a backlash within the party. He is sort of trapped now. How do you bring voters back, but then also avoid facing a rebellion within the LDP? And I don't know how he's going to square that. And it is going to be a competitive election. And I think we should be prepared for that. And if he comes out of the general election with a smaller majority, that is going to affect his ability to govern. And we could be seeing a change of leadership sooner rather than later. And maybe that's a good point to stop for the moment.
And Tobias, I'm wholeheartedly with you, and I think it's very, very early days, but certainly the start has not been particularly impressive. Where in the money world, in the world of investment, there's been a lot of flip-flopping, right? No, I don't agree that interest rates should go up. Oh yes, the Bank of Japan is independent and they can do whatever they want, etc., etc. Now, let me ask you a very specific question, and you sort of alluded to that. If you look at the initial popularity, opinion polls, obviously he gets a bump, from the lows of Kishida. But, compared to the previous 10 prime ministers, it's the lowest ranking. I think he's like almost 10 percentage points, below where Kishida was when he came in. Let me ask you a very blunt question. How high do you think is the risk that the LDP, is going to lose a significant number of people in the lower house election? And let's say significant being, more than 10 people.
So I think just on the approval ratings for a second. So not only is the bump that he got smaller than some of his predecessors and his direct predecessor, but also it's discouraging in particular because the whole point of bringing in Ishiba was here's someone who's been the most popular politician in the LDP for a long time, and he was going to bring people back, and this was going to be the answer, and the fact that actually that didn't have that effect, at least not right away, should be discouraging both for Ishiba and also for the LDP. I think what I thought was interesting, though, is that if you look at the polls, I think there's a lot of withholding of judgment so far. There were a lot of no replies, and I suspect people and there were signs that people still do like Ishiba. I think it's just a question of not knowing, okay, let's see what he does before we actually um, you know give him our approval. So maybe it's a glass half full kind of situation, and that there's a chance that that he depending on what he does, that he does bring people around. But so far, I mean, I think those flip-flops, I think that there is probably something discouraging to the public about that. And I mean, there is I mean, the LDP has a majority roughly independently has a majority of roughly 30 seats. It has a coalition. The coalition has a majority of roughly 60.
Yep.
Given how many scandal implicated LDP members you have in the mix, given that the opposition is really talking now about focusing its kind of coordinated efforts on the most scandal implicated LDP members, it is entirely possible that the LDP could be in a position where its independent majority is at risk, which, given that Ishiba did not have to call this election, that you start getting into trouble at that point. And so the possibility of losing more than 10 seats, yes. I mean, I think that it just, as things stand at this moment, and it's going to be a pretty fluid situation, and the opposition is still trying to figure out which candidates it's running where, and the LDP is figuring out its situation with its candidates. Is that, are dozens of seats potentially at risk for the LDP? Yeah, I think so. I think that is a reasonable position at this point.
I mean, it's very interesting, right? That when the campaign for the LDP president was going on, and we had young Koizumi being very quick to say, "Hey, I'm going to call an election immediately." And there are many people who think that he, when announcing that, he actually lost the support of the 80-some upper house members, who cast the vote. Because, as you know, the upper house is up for election in the summer of next year, June, July. And the LDP does not have a majority in the upper house. It's quite normal under any sort of political cycle that whoever comes in, is going to peak, 3 or 4, or initially peak 3 or 4 months into the regime, and then sort of the honeymoon period is over. So, I mean, if you cast, Tobias, your net a little bit wider, is really, are we going back to sort of a potentially Nejiri Kokkai, like a hung parliament situation where Japan cannot pass laws?
I mean, I think, certainly worrying about the upper house election next year is, very, I mean, also given the tendency of voters to use the upper house elections to, to punish governments they don't like, that is certainly something to be cognizant of. I think, look, I think in general, and when the kickback slush fund scandal broke last year, I wrote on my newsletter, Observing Japan, I wrote that this was the beginning of a new period of political competition, of political fluidity, that we had gotten used to this stable dominance during the Abe years, and it had continued under his successors, and that had been taken for granted, that the LDP was strong, the opposition was scattered and divided and weak, and that was the world we could all assume that the LDP was just, national elections would come around, the LDP would win comfortably, turnout would be fairly low, and I think clearly that does not prevail anymore. that, the LDP has been back in power for 12 years. Voters are very frustrated. They've shown their frustration in a number of different ways. And the frustration the LDP is not the only object of that frustration. I think, you look at what happened in the Tokyo gubernatorial election and Renho's pretty disappointing third place finish, and that you had this small town mayor come out of nowhere, and I mean, there's a lot of real frustration with corruption, with what the government's doing, how responsive the government is, and the fact that that Ishiba was not just greeted with this, with a stampede of support, says that it's not going to window dress changing, changing the drapes is not gonna satisfy that. And I mean, I have my questions. I mean, I had questions before the Constitutional Democrats picked their new leader. I continue to have questions, but whether going back to an old DPJ prime minister was going to really scratch the public's itch for change. But it does, I think, signify a more competitive CDP. I think it does suggest that we're just likely to see a political situation that is more fluid, that is more competitive than we saw from 2012 until last year, basically.
Yep.
And that we can't take for granted that the LDP is going to be in a position to do whatever it wants, that it's going to just have these large stable majorities that enable it to push through anything it wants, to govern the way it wants. And just to bring it back kind of to where we started, that I mean, if you're anticipating any kind of policy change that comes with the slightest bit of risk to the LDP's position, they're not going to be really in a position to do that. And, I mean, I think in some ways it should be discouraging, the kind of backlash that Koizumi saw. I mean, I don't know how much he had really thought through the kind of proposals he was making, but the fact that he, kind of stepped out and said something that was maybe a little controversial and was hit back and really paid a price for it, tells you that this is going to be, we are seeing a more cautious LDP. It is an LDP that is going to stick with what it has worked. It is not going to be taking big risks, and it might not feel that it's in a position to really take big risks. Particularly if it comes out of the general election having lost some seats, if it has weaker leaders. And so that, I mean, the politics is going to shape the climate that that everyone's operating with, and it is going to be a different climate than we've seen over the last decade.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, because I mean, I think, Tobias, you and I, if we'd met, 4 or 5 months ago, there was almost like this dismay. Oh my God, there's the challenge station, the spirit to challenge has gone out of the LDP. And all of a sudden, boom, here we are with 9 candidates being fiercely competitive and very tactical in sort of the way votes are being cast here. So the domestic metabolism in the LDP, as well as amongst the opposition parties, certainly has stepped up, which means it's a much, much more competitive, and ultimately, as a result of that, probably a little bit less predictable environment that we're in on the political side. We've got one question from the audience, from Paul Diamond, and thank you, Paul, for asking the question. Tobias, for international affairs and diplomacy, how much of a role, in your opinion, did that play in the LDP election?
I mean, I think it, and I mean, certainly as the race went on, I think it maybe weighed more on people's thinking. In the, you had this, this incident in China, really several different incidents with China that I think put international affairs on the table. But I think it's new. I think it ended up playing a more nuanced role than it looked, sort of before the campaign started, and everyone was talking about, who's going to be the Trump whisperer, who, like over the summer, when it looked like Kishida might still be in the running. And the assumption was Trump was guaranteed to win. And therefore, that was going to be the main qualification. I mean, clearly, I don't think the race ended up really really being based on that per se. But clearly, I think international experience was something that was going to separate, the winner from the loser, and I think it probably hurt Koizumi ultimately. I mean, that I suspect that, as everyone was sort of kicking around, Takaichi versus Ishiba versus Koizumi, the fact that his international experience was so slender, that he had, this was just something where, the kind of things he was talking about were very anodyne, was not really offering kind of much in detail, much depth. I think, real questions about, what would it look like if Trump were to win and you put Koizumi in the room with him, and what does that interaction look like? I don't necessarily know if that necessarily sealed it for Ishiba, though. Again, I mean, I think Takaichi also maybe got dinged a little bit for her, sort of maybe questions about, is she going to exacerbate relations with South Korea that have been, improving and moving in the right directions? Is, is it going to, yes, like, people are unhappy about China, but would she be, too extreme on China and complicate issues when ultimately what is needed is maybe a little stability? So it's was Ishiba's, proverbial porridge sort of just right versus sort of the too kind of too hot Takaichi and too cold, Koizumi? Was Ishiba sort of, had the right amount of, experience and gravitas and sort of the right approach to the issues? That, it's hard. I mean, there's a nuance here. I mean, clearly, I think it was part of the picture. I don't think it was the only thing that mattered, but clearly it was part of it.
I mean, it's interesting. I think that, certainly Takaichi mobilizing the Nippon Kaigi, the more, nationalist, forces, and actually ending up with much higher than expected of the, non-parliamentarian vote, in the runoff section, was certainly quite interesting. But Tobias, I'm going to have to ask, your thought on the little Ishiba shock that happened with the publication at the Hudson Institute, the conservative think tank, of, we really ought to have a NATO in, Asia, which came a little bit out of, I don't know, left field, right field. I don't know what the proper thing is to say. But, what's, what's your take on that? You saw, one of the first reactions in public, at least, was from the Indian foreign minister, saying very clearly, my God, how dare you propose something like that without first consulting some of the Asian neighbors? So it was almost like a negative effect on the Asian neighbors, but it certainly was quite a negative effect on the United States, was it not?
So, I mean, look, he's been talking about an Asian NATO for a very long time, but the fact that, that he was, almost an afterthought in terms of thinking about who might actually lead the LDP. I don't think anyone actually put a lot of thought in that. I think the thing that probably creates maybe even more angst in the United States is his talk about revising the status of forces agreement, because that is, that is directly between the United States and Japan, and an Asian NATO obviously has to bring in lots of other partners. It's telling, though, of course, that he's already walked it back, right? It was not in his policy speech on Friday. His foreign ministers, said this is something for down the road. Nagashima Akihisa, his defense policy advisor, has said this is something for down the road. So clearly, this is not something, that his government is going to be actively pursuing, in any kind of time frame that is realistic. And ultimately, so then we're going to be back in a world of continuity. He'll be.
So why do you think he? So why do you think he did that? I mean, he's now the head of the state.
So I mean, I think to some extent, I wonder almost if it's taken him some time to get used to the idea that, oh, actually, he's now the prime minister. I mean, almost in a, in much the same, the Hatoriyama back in 2009, right? Hatoriyama having these big picture ideas, and I mean, and the comparison might be apt also in that, Ishiba is not, he is someone with a lot of defense policy expertise, but he is not a U.S.-Japan alliance hand, that is not actually the world he comes out of. It is not something where, he's, of course, he's talked about how the fundamental problem in the U.S.-Japan relationship is how asymmetrical it is, and there needs to be greater equality, and that Japan is not fully independent. I mean, these are not the kind of things that someone who spends spent his career sort of in U.S.-Japan context says. I mean, he's something of an outlier. He's a little unusual, and is much more oriented to thinking about Asia and Japan's place in Asia. And so there is a certain echo to what happened with Hatoyama in 2009, where Hatoyama wanted more equality with the United States. He was talking about kind of remaking sort of Asian, an Asian security system, and that got people upset in the United States. And the difference is that Hatoyama or Ishiba's in the LDP, and there's people in the LDP who are going to say, whoa, you can't do this. But I think he's been an outsider and sort of the internal opposition within the LDP for so long that I mean, clearly, I think he's had to kind of get his mind used to the idea. Oh, wait, I'm prime minister now. I can't just go and rush headlong and say these things that I've been saying because I was sort of an outsider for all this time. And we'll see how long he lasts, and that will determine how much he's able to actually pursue some of these notions that he's had for a long time. But it's clearly, I think, taking him a little time to get used to it.
Tobias, it's fantastic that you bring up the comparison with Hatoyama, which also here in Tokyo, I hear a lot. I mean, as you're well aware, Hatoyama was, as you know, Ishiba is a Christian, and the previous LDP prime minister who was a Christian was Hatoyama. Not to make too much out of this, but I think that sort of having more independent, maverick or otaku type ideas, rather than being in the full consensus, may actually ultimately be a good thing. And I can tell you from a sort of financial and investment perspective, when you actually look at the cabinet, the composition of the cabinet, it's actually a very strong team. The fact that the chief cabinet spokesman, was not changed, is I think a very good thing. The fact that you've got probably the most underrated technocrat savvy politician as the Minister of Finance, Kato Katsunobu, unbelievably savvy in dealing with the bureaucracy and building a consensus and getting things done. Nothing radical here, but when it comes to policy implementation, really a very, very good team. The digital minister, again, I think, somebody very, very impressive who's got a spectacular track record of actually getting things done. So, I look at the overall team and I actually think, well, this is actually a pragmatic team. And yes, Ishiba, may have things to learn as a former otaku, but the LDP as a capable governor, is certainly very much in place. Let me switch on that, Tobias. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, no, I just want to second what you said about Kato, because I think in a different type of leadership election, he would have been, I think of, an incredibly strong contender, because I think he's someone who does have roots across the party, a lot of expertise, was trusted with, a lot of, challenging jobs under Abe and Suga. And so, I mean, the fact that he wound up in the finance ministry, absolutely, I think, should be an encouraging sign, and a sign, certainly an omen of the kind of pivot that we've seen overall. And so, absolutely second that. I mean, I think, a real capable member of a leadership team.
Tobias, let me ask you another question, which also comes from the audience here, which is this whole, when Kishida resigned, he said, oh, it's time for a generational change. And it was obviously interesting to see, two candidates in their 40s, being there, nobody in their 50s, and everybody else in their 60s. Now talk to me a little bit about this generational change in general. Your perceptions on that. We obviously have our knight in shining armor, Mr. Koizumi, And I thought it was very interesting that he doesn't get a minister job, but that he gets the job, as the guy basically in charge of the election, for the LDP. Talk to me a little bit about your view about the generational change that is underway. The people that you have your eyes on, within the LDP as future leaders. Talk to me a little bit about the new generation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny that you note the lack of people in their 50s. And I mean, I want to dig deeper into this because I think it's an interest. There is something of a hole demographically in the party, I think, where you do have, this generation that entered politics in the 90s, kind of fighting their last battles, people who've been around for a very long time, people who had to wait their turn because Abe was around for so long. Um, so you have that generation, and you do have younger lawmakers, people who entered politics, maybe in 2012 onward. What I wonder is if this is, and again, I think this requires a little digging around and looking. But I wonder if it's a consequence of 2009 actually, where you did have, this wipeout election. You had lots of people who lost, and when the LDP came back in 2012, in many cases you got new people instead of people who lost. I mean, in some cases, people who lost in 29 then came back, a few years later. But, in a lot of, many other cases, you just had the LDP nominated new people, and that was who came back when the LDP came back into power. And so instead of people who had at that point already been accumulating seniority, then just sort of picking up where they left off, in many cases, you got to start over again with new people, not all of whom are necessarily young. I mean, it's interesting how many of the so-called Abe children ended up actually being slightly older, but in that case, that also like they started their political careers late in life, and so they're also ultimately not necessarily going to really have a chance at um, being in that sort of inner circle of leadership contenders. And so, um, I mean, that is interesting to watch. In terms of who to watch, I mean, ultimately, I mean, I think looking at, it's a lot of hereditary politicians, right? I mean, remains Koizumi, Fukuda Tatsuya remains, I think, one of the sort of more prominent names from that generation. Kobayashi, I think he is now, I think, firmly fixed on the landscape as someone who's going to, be given responsibilities. I mean, obviously he's sitting this one out for, reasons reflecting the conflict within the party. I mean, look, a lot happens, what happens in the next several months in terms of, what happens in the general election, do you get a unity cabinet again down the road? How long does Ishiba stay around? When's the next leadership election? I mean, there's a lot of questions here that will determine, what happens with this next generation and how they compete. I mean, that I think is something of a discouraging thing about maybe the choices that Ishiba made, that it's also an old cabinet. I mean, it is a very, it is a very senior cabinet. No one in their 40s is in the cabinet. I mean, the average age is the same as Kishida's government, but it is a gray cabinet, and maybe that's just Ishiba. He wanted to have his reliable supporters in his government, and that's what he opted for at this point. But ultimately, I mean, you need to see governments really using, reshuffles and new cabinets as an opportunity to develop talent. And I mean, it was something that, the other reason why there is, I think, in some ways this gap, and why you had all these 60 somethings running, that one of the things that Abe, I think, didn't necessarily do well was build up this younger generation, give them the ability, the experience in having cabinet roles. And that I think was a shortcoming, that it was, that you did not have real investment in building up more of these younger
Yeah, yeah.
diet members and giving them, chances to acquire that experience.
It's interesting, Tobias, that you say that, and I'm not spilling any beans here, but we're being inundated at the moment with calls from Koizumi about trying to find young either entrepreneurs who want to do something in politics or young females who want to do something in politics, which is kind of in a way, to your point, the LDP sort of building out a bench of the next generation, that mechanism, is actually not very well developed. There's the hereditary stuff, and then it's always the last minute scramble for candidates in the sort of 10 days before the election campaign starts. You remember there was obviously the famous episode with Koizumi's children, right? And, for all intents and purposes, not a single one of them has actually, sort of been groomed to actual prominence in that. On a question from the audience, Tobias, I want to do one pivot, which is sort of, again, into the sort of specific policy that supposedly Ishiba derives strengths on, which is rural policy, rural revitalization, rural redevelopment. What are your thoughts on that? Is there actually something there, or is it just great marketing? In the sense of that, yes, he goes to the rural regions and listens a lot, but when you actually look at the policy proposals to actually revitalize, I mean, quite frankly, it seems like there is no there. What's your impression on Ishiba's rural revitalization strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think I fall on the same cap. I mean, it is perfectly understandable why this is something he cares about, and
Yep.
it's been an emphasis, and it's part of his political brand, and I understand it. I think it is something that's core to his political identity, but also this is such a long-term, deep structural problem, and I'm not I'm not convinced that moving universities or some of the other kind of idea that's going to get at why young people are leaving these places, why young people don't exactly want to leave cities, and how I mean, it's one of these things where there's so many not interconnected problems that how do you one of young who are going to be the pioneers, who are going to be the first young
Yeah.
people who leave Tokyo to go settle in in Tottori where he's from, right? Who's going to be the first to go, and how do you encourage them, and then how do you get sort of a flood going the other direction? It seems such a big problem. I mean, there's a reason why people want to be in the big cities. And so no,
Yeah.
I have not seen anything that really really presents itself as a silver bullet that solves this
And
multi-decade problem.
Yeah, and Tobias, I think we would both agree. I mean, first of all, I mean that's the gazillion-dollar question, and whoever answers it should win the Nobel Prize for Applied Economic Policymaking, right? I mean, this is a huge problem, and obviously there are some success stories. They obviously, at the hard end, is the TSMC factory building. Kitakyushu is on fire. Literally in the sense of the labor shortages that are there, the real estate prices actually increasing, but the broader issue of rural revitalization, actually does have to involve sooner or later a complete agricultural policy reform. And as just this summer, Japan was plagued with the highest ever rice prices. And, this is not because the yen is weak. This is because of ultimately completely backward-looking, policy of limiting the supply, of rice with the set-aside policy, and the agricultural reform that is needed in the rural areas because of the generational change, is obviously a big challenge. And it would be great to actually see some of the policies that Prime Minister Abe tried to put into place. But as you know, were effectively boycotted, by the rural agricultural vested interests. Do you see any sort of hope in terms of sort of the Japan agricultural policy sort of becoming a bit more, shall we say, 21st century?
Well, I thought it was interesting, if you followed where the candidates were going and what they were doing and how many candidates, visited some farmer somewhere, deploying smart farming technology to, make farming more high tech. And I mean,
Right.
and that's great. More of that. Like all of that is great, but, does it scale?
Right.
How are the agricultural cooperatives, what, are they encouraging that? Are they discouraging it? What part are they playing? The fact that the average age of the Japanese farmer is, essentially retirement age, um, that getting more production in higher value added products for export has been the kind of holy grail and talked about. I remember when Abe was talking about we need to make we need to learn from the Netherlands and how the Netherlands has made agriculture this high value added and oh there's middle class consumers all through Asia who we should be selling Japanese branded and all of that sounds great. And it just seems like there's just been endless talk about it, and the action has been,
Yeah.
where's the follow through? And this
Yeah.
brings us back around to what we talked about earlier, which is, agriculture still has a lot of political clout. It has ability
Yeah.
to frustrate change, and if you don't have strong LDP-led governments, is that going to happen? Are you going to be able to make those changes? I mean, maybe Ishiba is someone who has worked in these issues. Maybe having the trust will make things possible that otherwise were not possible. But until he is politically secure, or unless he is politically secure, it is hard to see that happening.
Yeah.
And and that so it really does come back to that any change like this and I mean clearly there are also the efforts that we saw during the Abe years to promote consolidation,
Yeah.
greater economies of scale in farming has to happen, and
Yeah.
that's going to change the complexion of rural Japan, right? If you have
Yeah.
larger corporate farming, you're dealing with something very different. But I don't see how you continue to have how it continues to be a situation dominated by small,
Yeah.
older, retirement aged, relatively inefficient farmer. I don't see how that continues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole rural revitalization issue, obviously a very very difficult nut to crack under any circumstances, but perhaps from a your point about Ishiba being sort of a Nixon goes to China type of potential. But I certainly personally would like to see sort of greater policy clearance on that. Now we got a question from Melanie Brooks. Melanie, thank you. And the question is a very simple one, Tobias. Which is as a business person or investor, is there something new that we should expect under Ishiba, or is it basically going to be continuation of Kishida's policies? What do you think?
I think everything we've seen says that for the time being, this is a Kishiba cabinet.
Yeah.
I think that he's been very clear in his let's say
Yeah.
strategic pivots on certainly on macroeconomic policy, that this is
Yeah.
not going to be a big departure.
Yeah.
It is. I was surprised. I mean, and we saw, I think, multiple pivots, I guess, on monetary policy in the last week or so, going from, I mean, which was telegraphed during the campaign, and I think, and maybe it's just that it didn't get as much coverage. But if you look at the kind of manifesto that he put out during the leadership campaign, that he this was not yes, during the Abe years, he was, the leading critic of Abenomics and was critical of Kuroda and said that, this is just a narcotic and, it's going to have major side effects. But clearly during the campaign had said, we need, better, there needs to be clear communication between the BOJ and the government, and, we shouldn't move too quickly. And, that he had, I think, softened some of his stance, and maybe that was just not as remarked upon. But it was interesting how, when he, coming out of the meeting with Ueda last week, just how questioning he was. The stance he took sounded very critical of the BOJ's independence, and clearly he walked that back. But
so it's very interesting. I've had several opportunities of briefing Ishiba during previous jobs, and it's very interesting because he is completely different from Kishida. Kishida is somebody who takes notes. He doesn't have opinions. He barely asks questions. He basically listens to your lecture and writes it down, and then says, "Thank you very much for your valuable time." Ishiba is very different. Ishiba has opinions, and whether they're thought out or not, he argues, which is quite interesting. I will make one comment, in response to what to expect from Ishiba. I think that Kishida's move to, right from the word get-go, announce this quest for a new form of capitalism was actually brilliant. And the reason is that it got everybody thinking, oh, there is something. And of course, yes, everywhere in the world, people are confused and, dismayed by, what capitalism is delivering. But of course, in terms of, concrete policy action, nothing actually happened. But it gave investors, and it gave business people something to ponder about and to sort of think, there may be something coming in the future, which is always very important, to have the dream alive. And this is the point. The reality of the last 3 years is that for a business person, and particularly from an investor's perspective, the single most important thing was not the government, was not the LDP, but was the Japanese stock exchanges holding corporates accountable for lazy balance sheet with the price to book and cost of capital campaign that they launched, last year. And Melanie, and in response to some other questions, I fully anticipate that before the end of this year, we are going to see a next wave of private sector initiatives, basically, holding corporate executives more accountable. Specifically, I anticipate that you will see greater pressure to actually safeguard minority shareholders' rights. Because as you know, in all this pickup in corporate metabolism, whether it's MBOs or whether it's M&A, the actual price determination is done in a completely, shall we say, unfiduciary way in response to minority shareholders. So I think that, whether it's the Tokyo Stock Exchange or whether it's from the FSA, whether it's from the Pension Association, I think the great thing is that the private sector initiatives from civil society, from the Tokyo Stock Exchange, from the bodies actually enforcing corporate governance and capital stewardship, that genie is out of the bag, and you are going to see greater and more persistent initiatives, that actually help improve to mobilize the latent assets that Japan has. It's not Ishiba, it's not the LDP, it's the private sector doing those initiatives. That's my personal opinion on this.
And that brings us brought full circle, also talking about the things that are happening bottom up that,
exactly.
Brings us whether the government is getting in the way or hindering or just standing to the side. The one, just on I think the point you made about the new form of capitalism was spot on. What I do think Kishida actually ended up doing, and this was, I think, not what he necessarily had in mind when he started, when he was talking about a new form of capitalism, but what he did do, I think, was really fully embrace the idea, not that globalization is over, but that clearly we've entered a new era in terms of the nature of the global economy, that businesses are going to take things other than price considerations when they make their investment decisions, and positioning Japan for an era in which, in the era of economic security and, sort of globalization infused with this notion of, political risk mattering in ways that it hadn't before, and recognizing that Japan actually has a number of assets that it can offer in that era. And I think seizing that and articulating that and grabbing onto that was actually, I think, quite important. And so in many ways, yes, new form of capitalism was just, Abenomics with a smiley face. But I think in other ways, that if we think about his legacy, it was, and the security side, positioning Japan as a frontline state. But then on the economic side, it was also positioning Japan for a world, of economic security and of the end of naive globalization, the end of, globalization where, yes, let's just bring China into the global economy and everything will sort itself out. That as we move away from that, that Japan had to do some things differently, and I think that is something that his government embraced wholeheartedly. So that, I think there were actually quite there was substance in some after the fact. The new form of capitalism that he was talking about was something different than I think he had in mind when he took office, but actually ended up being quite important.
Yeah, which is an excellent point to end on, which I think where we can, I think continue to expect great continuity. I think that the national economic security agenda, yes, ultimately dictated by the United States of America, but nuanced and refined, by the Japanese elite technocracy, particularly METI and the Ministry of Finance. I've got high confidence that that's going to be a great constant factor, irrespective ultimately, on who is going to be the prime minister here. Now, Michael, I think we've hit the end of our time. So if you want to wrap it up.
Thank you so much to both of you for the fantastic thing. I'm struck by a few things from our conversation. Firstly, the importance, it seems, of creating new pathways for people in their mid-careers into politics. So sort of fill that 50s gap, but with people who aren't their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers were also in politics. So I'm very curious to learn more about that in the future. And I'm also struck by the kind of change, looking back over the last few macro salons, from talking about 100% pass rate of legislation, but caution over governance reforms, to huge confidence in these governance reforms and seeing the impact that they're making, and caution over the influx in politics. So it's just seeing these sort of snapshots over every few months is a really fascinating way to sort of look into Japan. But yeah, thank you both so much for your time and your expertise and insights today, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you in 3 months' time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.